So I am thrilled to be here today. As JP said, we pulled this event together last year, and I'm very happy to be here with a group of very impressive women, as you'll see. They're leaders in industry, in finance, and in the First Nation communities, driving a conversation together. So the first guest speaker we're going to invite to the stage is Chief Sharleen Gale, Chief of the Fort Nelson First Nation, but also Chair of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and a current member of the Canada Electricity Advisory Council. So come join us, Chief Gale. Our second panelist today is Penny Favel. Penny is Vice President, Indigenous Relations and Sustainability at Hydro One. Come join us, Penny. And last but not least, Jaimie Lickers, Senior Vice President, Indigenous Markets at CIBC. Make sure we get some water for all three of you. We've got a really good conversation to have today. And I want to start off, Chief Gale, you're here, you're next to me. You've had a lengthy journey in leadership, starting in 2009 in elected leadership at Fort Nelson First Nation. Can you tell us a bit about what you have experienced over the years with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition? Give us a sense of the topic of growth as it relates to Indigenous nations and communities.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces here and some great friends and allies. A pleasure to be here again. The last time I was on one of these stages, I fell on my face 3 times before I got off. It was quite funny.
But you came back.
Hopefully that doesn't happen again. So my journey has been quite the experience. I've been on council for a good 15 years. Before that, I moved out of my house when I was 14. And, that's a challenge for many of our Indigenous people because of the residential schools and the systematic challenges that come with that from generation to generation. And I talk about this because I think it's really important because it's the reality of what our people and our young people are facing in our communities, and they really do need opportunities. And I had a little bit of a reality check. I was in Winnipeg this week, and I'm on the Canadian Electricity Council. And when I got to my room and I went over to the restaurant across the street, when I got out of there, I found a little marble. And it brought me back to when I was a little girl, growing up in the city, living in poverty with my mom. And my mom is my champion. She's built me to who I am today. But I think about those times, and I think about who I was as a little girl, and then growing up and having to, at high school I worked in a mill on weekend cleanup, and I had to work 3 jobs just to get through high school. And then I had a great career working for oil and gas for 20 years at the Fort Nelson gas plant, and I'm really proud of the work that I did there and what I was able to learn working through the different departments. And then one day my mom said, you know what, there's a by-election, I want to elect you for council. And I was like, okay, so the next challenge is on. What does that mean? I don't know. So I ended up getting into this role, and not even 3 years into the role, the former chief asked me, can we go for lunch? I want to ask you some questions. And she talked about my leadership and wanting to select me for chief and really endorse me for that. It was something that I've always wanted to do, but it's been very, very challenging, let's just say. I think about our people on a daily basis in every decision that we make. And, there was a lot of court challenges that I had to pursue for our people because of industrialization in our territory and the practices that weren't aligned with our people's values, to the point where I met Nilo and a great group of people that were working on those initiatives through the First Nation Major Projects Coalition back in 2014. And it just really hit me that this is the right path and this is the way we need to move forward. Our people have been through so much. I think about when you try to, get housing. We can't allow, banks will not lend us money unless the ban says, okay, well, you guarantee the loan. And so we do that for our own people. And when we started, going through this process of having equity ownership in major projects, I just knew that this was the path forward. This is a way that we could all come together and collaborate and work together. We've been pushed out of our economies because of the Indian Act. There's been so many challenges with that. The policies are completely outdated. And I just wanted to share a little bit of like who I am, where I come from. And I have to say that with the Clark Lake, it served our community. It was an oil and gas field for 70 years. And through that process, we were able to redesign that project because it's a depleted oil and gas well. And right now we're working on Tudeka, which is a geothermal facility, and we're repurposing it, and it's 100% owned by Fort Nelson First Nation, and it's a new path forward for our people into renewables. It's bringing our young people home that have gone to university because there's opportunities, and the more opportunities that we can create within our own community through ownership makes me proud. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that personal story as well. That's very impressive, having a mother who's there behind you, pushing you forward, and leading you to this very important position that you're in today. Jaimie, I want to talk to you a little bit about your work at CIBC, and I want to access to capital and access to affordable capital is very important, right? Part of this conversation. So, what role, as someone who works in a financial institution, do financial institutions play? What role do you play in economic reconciliation? I'm only on my first cup of coffee, so my words are going to come out eventually. Go ahead, Jaimie.
Me too. I'm only on my first cup of coffee. I knew you were going to come to me next when my good friend, dear friend, Chief Gale, mentioned the banks. I'm the banks, right? In this discussion, at least, I'm the banks. Look, I think it's a really important question. It's a very timely question. I think the real enemy is the Indian Act, and it has been for quite some time, because the banks are unfortunately subject to the same limitations and restrictions as Indigenous people are when it comes to the application of the Indian Act on reserve lands in particular. And so that inability of nations and community members to utilize and leverage their most valuable assets in the way that other players in the Canadian economy are able to is a huge limitation. It's a hurdle for all First Nations communities that continue to be governed by the Indian Act and other pieces of legislation as well. But that prohibition creates the biggest hurdle for access to capital. And that's why we're constantly having discussions around the role that both the private sector can play, that financial institutions can play, and that the government should play in this discussion. It's a piece of government legislation. Government has to be part of the solution, and financial institutions also have to be part of that solution. And we're playing a role in that discussion, I think, at a very important level in terms of what a loan guarantee program could look like that would be sector agnostic, that would be available in a timely fashion to Indigenous communities. Sorry, Penny, I'm stealing. Penny and I are on the same page on this, right? That any federal loan guarantee program, it has to be sector agnostic, and it has to operate at the speed of projects, not just the speed of business, but the speed of projects. And if we can't do that, the value proposition of a loan guarantee program will be significantly impaired. So that is key, and I think we're all waiting eagerly for the budget next week, and that's what I'm going to be looking for, is what support is available to the financial institutions to make affordable capital available. I want to support communities like Chief Gale's. I want to work together. We want to get there. It's in everybody's best interest, and I think we can do it.
Well, I think you're all on the same you're all singing from the same song sheet, right? So I know there's going to be, you're working together, you're collaborating, so I know you're going to steal each other's points of view, which makes sense. But Penny, I'm going to go to you next. You're at Hydro One, you've been there for a few years. Can you tell us, but you've also been in the energy sector for a long time, so you have a good sense of this. So can you talk to me a little bit about Hydro One's journey through economic reconciliation, engagement with nations and communities, and what's been going on over the past 3 years in particular?
Yeah, thanks. So I can talk to you a little bit about picking up what Jaimie said, and I think what the chief said about everyone actually has a piece in this, and industry's got to figure this out a little bit faster and better. So yeah, I'm similar to the chief, oil and gas background, pipelines, natural gas pipelines, really my most recent experience, Coastal GasLink when I was at TC. But Hydro One's journey has been interesting. It's similar in the sense it's linear infrastructure. So how do you do that well? And also, how do you do that in a way that recognizes that when the transmission lines went in 70 years ago, and I hope everyone in the room who is an ally and who's non-Indigenous understands this, they stopped when non-Indigenous people didn't need the lines anymore. And so you have Indigenous communities that are not served by electricity. The company that I'm president of, Hydro One Remotes, in addition to my work at Hydro One, is all diesel generated. Now, Wataynikaneyap, thank goodness it's there. It's changing things. But imagine that, 70 years ago, we're in your traditional territory. We've been there for 70 years. You've taken all the risk of us coming in, and you're looking at the wires, and you're looking at your family, and you're saying, yeah, we're either don't have electricity or it's diesel generated. And if anybody has been in a community that's diesel generated, it's loud, it's dirty, and we don't want our kids around it. So diesel generation has a place. So how does industry do better? So Hydro One, I actually am really proud. I've been there for about 3.5 years. Hydro One was really open when I said, we have to do better. We have to stop saying that we're going to give you something. We actually have to start saying linear infrastructure, and I learned this in the West, I learned this in the oil and gas industry. Linear infrastructure, it doesn't just benefit from Indigenous partners, it needs Indigenous partners. It does not get built if you do not have Indigenous partnerships. And it really shouldn't, but it doesn't. And the other thing is, when you have Indigenous partners, and this is, I'm talking as a person who's been a commercial lawyer for 1 million years, and who's been in this space for a really long time, you get a huge commercial advantage if you have Indigenous partners. Why? Because your environmental assessments are better, you get traditional knowledge, you get traditional land use, they're faster, you get better access to land, and guess what? When you reach out to your partners and you say, hey, we're having some issues with landowners, for example, where we've had on other projects, guess who your first allies are? Your partners, because they get it. So Hydro One's done a really great thing in my view. They've been very open to the 50-50 equity model, which really is industry leading. And it's based on the premise that if I'm going to be your partner, and this is, the way I do my work is, if the chiefs tell me something, I will advocate for it as much as I can, and this comes from the chiefs. And they were like, Penny, it's not difficult. If you want to be partners, it's 50-50. And I was like, I think I can sell that, because you can sell it in Ontario because the model is there. So how do I do that? Well, it's really easy. You just say, you go and do a 50-50 model, and you don't bicker back and forth negotiating. Is it 30? Is it 40? Oh, gee, chief, would you take 44%? Like, no, 50%, half, all the time. As we go forward, then we can actually talk about the important things. Like, how should we site this transmission line so it's sensitive to areas? What are some of the benefits you personally want for your communities? And linear infrastructure is very unique in the sense that you tend to have a lot of communities. It's not like a mine where you have 2 or 3. So you have to be really good at engagement, really, really good at listening. So Hydro One's journey has been one of recognizing we had a 70-year history that we had to not be afraid to face and proudly say we can do better. And to say, let's talk about the important things, which is not, It's not, oh, how much equity will we give? It's, let's be partners and build these lines together. So that's Hydro One's journey. And I can't stress enough that and I hopefully I'm not saying anything you don't already know. You shouldn't be doing anything that isn't community-led. The very last thing that Indigenous communities need, in my experience, is another non-Indigenous person like me going in and saying, I've solved your problem. I have this great idea, and we're gonna fix everything. Everything that's been successful at Hydro One has been community-led, and it's been a question of me listening to the chiefs. So.
Such an important point, and it's about visiting communities and having the conversations, and I think that's what Hydro One is doing. So that's really good to hear. This is a question for all three of you. I think I'm going to go to Chief Gale first, though. It's a broad question around what governments and private sector partners really need to do to ensure a successful working relationship with First Nations communities and Indigenous communities more broadly. So you can take that from any perspective.
When I think about that, I think about how diverse we are as First Nations across this country and how many communities and nations there actually is. And so when you ask that question and you go to a community and say that your project covers many nations along the line, you're going to get a different answer from different nations. And that is common because we all have different values that we want to incorporate, or different cultures, different languages. And I also think that, when you build a relationship, it's about communication. It's about being there for each other. It's about talking about how you're going to work together in the future, how you're going to communicate, what's your common goals, and what are the overlapping values. But I also think that when you do this process, it's really important to really talk to First Nations on day one of the project, because we have land use plans, and land use plans are very important because they identify where projects can and cannot go. Buffer zones around very special places, sacred places, watersheds, and so forth. But I think it's important to put this on a perspective of when your board of directors, they want to implement a change. And so you don't just bring one model and then say, okay, tomorrow we're going to do this model. No, you invest. You invest in the training. You invest in your staff. You invest in meeting with your managers and your directors. You go through a whole change management process. And that, brings buy-in from your staff, and it helps bring a meaningful dialogue about what the company is trying to achieve. I don't think that's anything different than when you come to a First Nation. We need to build a meaningful relationship. We need to ask the nation what their priorities are. What do they want to see out of the project? Like Penny said, the chiefs, were very adamant that we needed 50%. And I take great pride in the work that, you guys have done, and along with our member communities. That's very powerful. And I think that you're going to see that is the new norm, and it needs to happen. When we think about the projects that need to be built so that we can keep our economies going, we have a lot to offer. And I think about what my good friend JP always says, is that our land and our resources is our equity. And if you want access to that, then you have to work with our elders. You have to work with our members and our youth. The other thing that I think about is the need for FPIC. We all know that people have different definitions of that. Some people get scared of that. It's really not that complicated if you start sitting down with the First Nation and start talking about it. But when it comes to free, we need support for comprehensive community planning. We need technical support. We need engineering support. We don't have those expertise within our own communities. When I think about the prior part, it's about allowing the community to go through that process, to make an informed decision, to talk to our members, to invite you into our communities and talk about what the project actually is. And then when I think about informed is, having time for our members to sit at the table and really analyze what this is going to mean for the 7 generations to come. It's one of the things that we always think about when we're involved in these projects is this going to be meaningful for our kids and the people that live among us? Because in Fort Nelson, you know, we have a really good relationship with our municipality. We don't only think about our people, we think about the treaty we signed and how that's peace and friendship. And we want to invite people to live in our territory and to raise their children. These are all fundamental things that need to happen to have a meaningful partnership. And yeah, I have to go back to the 50-50 model with Hydro One. I can't say how proud I am enough of that process. You guys done tremendous work. You know, I'll be meeting with the former chief, Jackie French, and you know, I take great pride in that, and I know that she did too. So thank you.
She really did. She was amazing.
Do you want to add a perspective to that question as well, Penny? Just what needs to happen?
Yeah, I will. I mean, I can't say much to improve. I will say industry needs to go earlier. Not when you're starting the project, when you're thinking about the project, when you're planning the project. You're going to have better project outcomes. I'm a construction lawyer by training, so I'm all about planning. And guess how long we know that a project's going to be? We know like a year or 2 before. So we're in community now at Hydro One, talking even before we have projects. And this is the new way I'm structuring engagement at Hydro One. And it's because for too long, we've really just gone to communities in a transactional way and said, okay, we have a project, here's some capacity funding, will you engage with us? And it's actually where that model was useful about 10 or 15 years ago because it needed to be. But now, go into those communities early, and I'm talking, there are communities where we go in 18 months. We started in the Northeast. We started talking to communities 18 months to 24 months ago. And guess what? It wasn't about, hey, Hydro One's got this transmission line. It was, you know what? We're the 94% of the wires, the big ones, that belong to us. Can we have a chat with you about your priorities? What's going on in your community? And guess what you hear? You hear infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. And guess what big companies that do linear are good at? Infrastructure. And so there will be many times where we will be talking to the communities about roads. Do you know how dangerous some of the roads are, and a simple road widening that we could do while we're already in the community? A simple road widening, street lights. It seems like table stakes to us, but where an elder wants to be healthy and be walking on the reserve and they don't have street lights. Something like schools and water, and guess what they all need? Electricity. But there's roads and schools, and to have that conversation makes you a better partner. We've got to work on being better partners. Go out earlier, go out before you have a project.
Jaimie, going to you on the financial side of things. You've obviously identified one key barrier to financing Indigenous owned projects. Are there other barriers that you want to emphasize for us, other challenges that you are seeing from your perspective?
Well, I think my friends and colleagues have already identified a few barriers, and maybe I'll just touch on, from a financial perspective, how we view the importance of those partnerships and FPIC, for example, and the role that financial institutions can play. And I think we have the benefit in many cases as a financial institution of being really transactional driven, being demand driven by our clients. No one is coming to us for financing if they haven't already decided that it's something they want to do. So we get, to a large extent, to avoid that question of what happens before you get to the point of actually financing and moving ahead with a transaction. So we're really relying on our private sector partners to do all of the things that Chief Gale mentioned and that Penny mentioned, right? To be abiding by free, prior, and informed consent, to be engaging with Indigenous communities in meaningful and respectful ways, to be recognizing the value of their contribution to the project, which is often in the form of the use of their lands and territories, right? I think where we play a role as a financial institution is in supporting and incentivizing and rewarding that behavior from our project proponent clients, and recognizing that those companies that are entering into partnership, true partnership with Indigenous communities, that we can play a role in how we prioritize that financing and in the terms of that financing. And so the great work that Penny is doing and Hydro One is doing, that should be incentivized by the financial institutions. And that's what we're working hard to do. I also think there is a really important role that all of us can play in the private sector, regardless of your industry, and that is in increasing the Indigenous voices around the table and within our institutions. There is a dramatic underrepresentation of Indigenous voices in the business and finance space. You know, my friend JP here is doing a fantastic job of being that beacon and that role model, but he's one guy. Yep. Can we have more? Can we have more JPs? Can we have more Chief Gales? And I would like to not be the only voice, and I'm not the only voice in the financial sector. I have great colleagues at the other institutions that are also out there doing great work, but we need more. And we need our communities to also support the pipeline that we're trying to develop of young Indigenous people that want to be in business and finance. And our institutions will all be better for that increased representation, and it's really a collective effort from government, private sector, and the institutions and the community to get our young people thinking about how they can play a role in business and finance and in wealth management for their own communities.
The theme of the Growth Summit is obviously productivity, so you're pointing to that, the opportunity for young people to see a space in the financial world, in business. What's key to doing that? What's the most, we obviously have advocates here, but what else needs to happen from your perspective? Chief Gale?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
It's how do we ensure we're ensuring that we're making that pipeline, those opportunities, we're showcasing them for young Indigenous First Nations people in Canada?
Thank you. Yeah. It's a great question. We've been investing in our people for over 43 years. Fort Nelson First Nation has Challow School, and it's a private school, but we open it up to the public, and we bus non-Indigenous kids to our nation so that they can attend. I know that some of you may have come to Morning Circle. We start the day off right. We start with our language, and we talk about the kids have an opportunity to use their voice and talk about what they have done with their family over the weekend. We all know that First Nations don't get enough money from the federal government to be able to do what we need to do to send our kids off to school. So it's really important to have our own source revenue to be able to provide those opportunities. Just for our nation, we just did our budget, we invest $1 million. And one of the things that's really important to me is if a mother wants to go to school and she has 5 kids, let's fund her to go to school, and let's give her an allowance so that she can look after her 5 kids and not worry about having to work, because you already know that she's going through so many challenges. And the hope is that, once she gets her education and her degree or her master's or doctorate, whatever it is, that she will come back and she'll work for our people. And that's an investment, that is so important. And I think that, not a lot of us nations have the capacity to do or the ability. So that's why it's so important to have that own source revenue so that we can invest in our own people. And I talked about Tudeka, geothermal, and I'm proud to say, we got our own people running this. This is 100% Indigenous owned by our nation. And we have young people coming home, and they're excited, and they're sharing their ideas, and they're leading this.
Right. And your community is essential to the energy transition. So let's maybe make a segue there, because you're including young people in that work. You're ahead of you're leading this work, right? So maybe we can talk about how governments and regulators properly equip and support Indigenous participation in this energy transition that we're all going through and we're all aware of.
Well, we know that if we're going to get to where we need to go, we really need to accelerate our processes. We need to fast track them. We need to think differently. We need to work with industry and government and First Nations to really find the solutions. And we're always doing that through the work that we do through the First Nation Major Projects Coalition. Many of you are aware of the Yahi decision. I mean, I am right in the middle of that, and I think that with that process could come some really great change where it's shared decision-making on the land, not only for my people, but for the government. And I have to say that, I look forward to that. I'm very optimistic. There's a lot of challenges. I talked about my early years as a chief. Like, I didn't want to spend time fighting people in the court system and winning each and every time. In that decision, any permit that, any consultation, they'd just come to the nation, they would sit at the table, they would tell you what they were gonna do, you would say your concerns, and it just went to deaf ears. And then the permit was approved and the project just kept going. And it came to a point where the only thing that would trigger an environmental assessment was gas plants. And when the BC government said no environmental assessment for gas plants while we're having an LNG conference from ship to shale, bringing First Nations together, government and industry, to talk about how can we find the solution, how can we be meaningfully involved, how can we take this a step further and build this project on time with all of us included and all Canadians, and to having that decision, an order in council, no environmental assessment for gas plants, it was going to mean that it was going to be a free-for-all in our territory, and our values, our culture, and our traditions, and our livelihood were going to be impacted hugely, and our people wouldn't be able to hunt, fish, and trap at the way they have always done. And so that was very alarming for me, and it wasn't an easy decision from my people to say, we need to ask them to leave, and we need to drum them out with an honor song so that us First Nations from ship to shale can have this really important conversation. I do see things shifting. I do see BC changing things, and the federal government, but we do have a lot of work to do. And we're as First Nations, ready to do that work. So we invite you to that conversation as industry and as government.
Thank you. Around the same lines as that, on that question to Penny and Jaimie. From your sector perspectives, First Nations people are essential to this energy transition, right? Where are you seeing that opportunity in that role? And where obviously, Penny, you are bringing power to communities. What does that look like from Hydro One?
So I just want to be clear, I'm not bringing power to communities. I'm nice enough to listen. Yes. 2 ears, one mouth. Grandmother taught me that years ago. I want to be clear, though, the energy transition in Ontario is really, really exciting, and it's happening really fast from an electricity perspective. So get on board, because we've got a decade to get this right. So what I can say is it's frustrating that the only conversations are around the regulatory and the legal. Like, the fact that Indigenous communities have to go to the courts, and I can tell you, like, there's a few lawyers up here, it takes 20 years to do something, right? Like, that's not the speed of business. That's not even, I don't know what that speed is. It's like how I get out of bed in the morning at 5 in the morning to get here to see you guys. But I can tell you, industry has a role to play, and it ties into the speed that we have to build stuff, which means you have to have more Indigenous communities actually working on your projects and long-term attracting people to your company. Guess what the next big challenge is in front of us? Talent. We don't have enough people to build all of this infrastructure. Guess what the biggest demographic pool of talent is? Indigenous communities. So I want bankers and lawyers, but I also want people to be proud to be in the trades and to come and work at Hydro One and come and work in our forester department. Like, you want to see people who are proud of what they do, keeping the lights on after a storm. I want Indigenous kids to say, you know what, it's okay not to go to university if that's not my thing. And I say, please come and work at Hydro One. But guess what Hydro One has to do and all industry has to do? And I'm proud of Hydro One because they do address this. We did a sort of soup to nuts barriers review about why can't we keep Indigenous employees? Why can't we attract them? And then you have to make some changes. You actually have to understand that for somebody to come from a reserve where that's their whole life and their whole family, and you say, oh, guess what, you have to move to Toronto. Well, that's not on. Or you have to go to the Sioux, or you have to go to Timmins. No, why don't we acknowledge that actually the work that we need done in the field is smack dab in the middle of traditional territories, and guess where our talent base is. So start moving there. If you're going to build this energy infrastructure, you need to address the talent wars, you need to address the equity question, you need to address the regulatory question. But it has to be all three of those things. And for us, the equity question is really prominent right now because as Hydro One, you think about all this infrastructure that Ontario needs to build just for electricity and how much equity financing needs to be, that Indigenous communities need to find. That's why, that's how come Jaimie and I have just, it feels like 2 years we've been talking about this. Because as soon as we got the equity model across, I was like, okay, what do we want to make sure Indigenous communities can find access to cheap money so they can invest. And industry has a role there too. Hydro One's really, really strongly behind bugging our banks and saying like, you're financing us, so let's get some of those rates that are available to Hydro One, available. What do we have to do? And that's why we work with the banks, because the banks actually do want to do it. They see this book and they want it, so.
I think that's actually a great segment to this question. That's been
I've just
bothering
noticed,
me.
no one told me slide it was on, and now I've seen it, so please.
This question about people are looking for more information on how exactly the Indian Act limits access to capital. And I sometimes take it for granted in Indigenous circles, we wake up muttering about the Indian Act. You don't have to tell anyone about the limitations in the Indian Act. So I forget sometimes in different audiences that knowledge isn't there. It's very straightforward. There is a particular provision in the Indian Act, it's Section 89, that limits the ability of Indians and bands, those are both defined in the Indian Act, from using their real and personal property that is situated on a reserve location as security. So all of their reserve lands and all of their property, if it's owned by the Indian or by the band, situated on a reserve, is prohibited from being used as security. There is no ability to seize or act on those assets in any way if you have a lending facility that finds itself in default. And so you've removed the most significant, if not all of the assets of nations, of First Nations and First Nations people across the country to leverage the assets that everyone else can leverage very easily, whether it's your land, your home, your other personal property. And so when nations come to banks looking for financing, if all of their property and all of their assets is either the reserved land itself or is situated on a reserve, then really, and look, we found creative ways to solution these issues. I don't want to suggest that the banks are not capable of finding solutions, but at the end of the day, you're talking about unsecured lending, right? You're talking about fully unsecured lending, and we're not talking about $100,000. We're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions to engage in the projects that Penny and Chief Gale are talking about today. So it's a big hurdle.
Chief Gale, did you want to add one more thing? I know we're getting close to the end of the time, so.
I do have to leave pretty soon. I just wanted the opportunity to invite you all to our conference that we're going to be having here in a couple weeks on April 22nd, 23rd. It's going to be a great conversation. I think a lot of the questions and things that you guys are wanting to know, you'll learn at that conference. There's a lot of great people that are going to be there in government, industry, a lot of First Nations from across Canada that are working on these issues. And I think one of the very exciting things is that we're going to be releasing our Indigenous electrification strategy. And from that strategy, there'll be many teachings and learnings. And, my great friend JP and his team have been very instrumental in helping us get this document out. And I think, you'll be very surprised with it. There's 13 challenges for Indigenous ownership of electrification projects in Canada, 7 Indigenous-owned electrification projects and policy highlights across Canada's jurisdictions, and there'll be 18 recommendations for government and regulators coming from that, and 10 for the private sector, and 16 for Indigenous nations. So we all have a lot of work to do, and I think out of that document you will find that we can find those solutions by working together. Another highlight is that we just released our conference primer, so check that out. If you haven't signed up, please join us. We'd love to see you there.
And it's the first time it's in Toronto. So
Yeah,
so you'll be here, which is wonderful. I thank all three of you for the conversation, for sharing your knowledge. Some key takeaways are engaging early with nations and communities. Obviously, equity partnership, we know that is essential. I think I will leave it to JP to reflect further on the importance of Indigenous ownership. But I really, really appreciate having 3 strong women, speak your points of view and for such a large audience for this morning's conversation. Thank you for coming out.